Hello, everyone, and welcome to another of our little video chats here at CE Pro. Today, I have with me Ryan Jaso of Lighting Boss here to talk about adding a bit more color into our landscape lighting projects, which, considering it's spring for pretty much everyone at this point, New England's still a little bit cold. I feel this is pretty timely. Ryan, thank you for coming on. I always love to sit down and chat with you because if I can be a little bit selfish here, I feel like I always learn something new when we're having these conversations.
I appreciate you saying that. Also, it's still cold in parts of the country. It's 90 degrees here today.
It's gonna change up around the week that we're talking. It's supposed to kick up to 80 in Massachusetts on Tuesday, I think. But this past weekend it was like in the 50s, I want to say.
I'll trade you in a heartbeat.
So, Ryan, you recently gave a talk on using color tunable lighting in outdoor installations. And for anyone that missed that, I highly recommend going to check it out. We should still have the recording up on cepro.com, and I'll try to leave a link in the description for whenever this video ends up. But for the here and now, I wanted to ask, what do you see as being the primary benefits to working with more color in your landscape designs?
Differentiation. And there are, it's such a good question. And there are people who, lighting's subjective. What I like isn't necessarily what you like. And ultimately what we're trying to do is make the homeowner, make the property owner love it. That's what we want. We're trying to make them happy. But as typical rule of thumbs, there are right ways and there are wrong ways to do it. And I see a lot of wrong when people are using color. What we recommend that people do is that they use splashes of color, and you use it to highlight certain features or certain foliage. Whereas what I see a lot of now is people using color just to sort of blast certain areas for holidays, things like that. And in many cases, it's a little hokey. The benefit of using color the right way, though, is that you can really differentiate yourself from competitors, and you can highlight things like Japanese maples or blue spruces by using the right color temperatures and mixtures of different colors, and really allow your project to stand out from the project down the street where the installer used 2700K 60-degree lamps on everything. So differentiation is, in a good way, is the benefit of using color in landscape.
Now, I guess before we get too deep into the weeds on it, would you mind just giving like a brief rundown of like color temperatures in lighting as a topic? We don't need to get like we don't need to get as in depth as like if we were talking about circadian lighting, but I feel like a lot of people, they might not be familiar with like the Kelvin system for measuring that.
That's funny. I was just talking about circadian rhythms with my 7-year-old, and I put him to sleep just having the conversation. He wanted to turn green on.
Well, hopefully that doesn't happen here.
I hope not. He wanted to turn green on for that little like light he has at the end of his bed. I'm like, no, buddy, we want to do red or we want to do an amber, because that works with your circadian rhythms and allows you to sleep. Well, that's not necessarily what we're trying to accomplish in landscape lighting. We don't want to put people to sleep with our landscape lights. But from a Kelvin temperature standpoint, really just the simple way to understand it is that we usually use a scale, starts around 1800 and goes up to around 6500. They call that the Kelvin scale. The lower on the scale you are, the closer to 1800, the more yellow, the more orange the light is. The higher you get on it, the more blue the color of the light is. So usually we're designing somewhere in between 2700K up to around 4100K, which is 3000K usually brings out true color. And then 4100K is almost exactly moonlight color. So that gives us a little more on the blue and white spectrum. So that's sort of in the Kelvin temperature scale. We're typically designing somewhere in between that 2700K to that 4100K. There's exceptions to every rule, but that's just kind of how we look at it in landscape lighting. So anything that you see over that 4100K is a bit unnatural. So that can be harsh to people. When you get outside the spectrum, it gets unnatural. When you stay inside of that spectrum, it's more natural light. So that's typically what we try to do.
Hmm. So you had mentioned there's a lot of people that are kind of doing color and outdoor lighting the wrong way. And so I guess the obvious question to follow up for that is like, what is the correct way to go about it? Do you normally just stick to a single color temperature and run with it, or is there the ability to mix and match with them?
No, I love the idea of mixing and matching. And again, you do that not only from a differentiation standpoint, because ultimately it's our jobs to get the next job, right? You want one project to turn into 10 projects. So how do we differentiate ourselves? How do we get the neighbors looking around saying, wow, that is an amazing design. I want my house to look like that. So you do it from a differentiation standpoint, but you also do it from a layering standpoint too. I can create different layers and different depths by using different color temperatures. So we love the idea. I mentioned 4100 is closer to moonlighting. So I love the idea of using my moonlighting of 4100K. Anytime I go up into a tree and shoot down, I'm typically using a 4100K to do it. What we'll often see is we'll see a little higher Kelvin temperature on architecture. So maybe I'll use 3000K on architectural elements and maybe something a little softer in the foliage. So maybe I'll do 2700K in the foliage. I know there's not a huge difference between the two, but you can see a difference. Even if you don't, if you're not even sure what you're seeing, your eye is seeing a difference at 300 difference in Kelvin output. So your eye is seeing a difference, even if it doesn't fully understand what it's seeing. There's a difference there, and that creates depth, it creates dimension, and it creates intrigue. So that's why we like to do it, is to separate ourselves and create different layers and different elements of intrigue.
Hmm. Now, you kind of touched upon it, talking about like, different strategies for working with architectural stuff, greenery. What are some good strategies for just kind of like figuring out how to best incorporate this stuff into a design? Because, when we're talking about something as big as like, somebody's backyard, some of these projects are like multiple acres. I feel like there's probably like a big kind of like, I don't know what's the word, just like paralyzation by choice, essentially, where you just can't figure out where to start.
Paralyzation by choice. That was good.
I
Yeah.
don't I don't even know if paralyzation is an actual word. It just kind of came up to me on the spot, but we're running Shakespeare rules today.
Yeah, you nailed it. I'm pretty impressed. Experimentation at home is the best way to learn landscape lighting. It is at your house, at neighbors' houses, at friends' houses. It's the best way to understand this. And I love the terminology you use, because you don't want to give the prospect too many choices. Maybe a couple of choices, but ultimately you're the expert here. You know what's going to be best based on their preferences, because you're having a conversation about their preferences. But you know that this particular Kelvin temp is going to look best on this tree in this scenario because you've experimented with it. And it's not about asking the clientele what, or their prospect, what their preference is in that. You're the expert. Okay. And a really good way to get them to buy in before you do all of this work and they say, oh, I hate it, is having an extensive portfolio. Not only experimenting at your house, at your friends' houses, at your family's houses, but photographing. Let's have this portfolio and show them, okay, this is why I like to use 4100K in this scenario. What do you think of this? Okay, great. This is why I use 2700K here. This is why I use red here, green or blue, whatever it is. I want to make sure that that clientele is happy. Now, let's say they're not. Let's say that you show them all the portfolio pictures in the world and you finish up, they sign off on it, you finish up the project, they're like, you know, I don't like it. It's also another good reason to use color changing and dimming products so that you can go up and make adjustments without having to change the entire fixture or change the lamps. It's good to have control of your product so that you can make adjustments without having to do a whole lot of work. So I do like to recommend that people who are comfortable with using color changing systems incorporate those type of products in their designs, just in case changes do need to be made, just because it makes life a lot easier.
Now, when you're, because you again, kind of going back to what you were saying about like lighting architectural elements versus the trees. I was just thinking, you know, you're playing with a lot of different colors for your subjects in those scenarios. So I have to imagine certain colors work better for those different elements. And we can talk about color temperature. We can also talk about just like regular color mixing in general, because I know on the webinar you showed an example of here's a tree lit with red, and you know the leaves just kind of turn brown in the red light. So when you're talking about like trees, architectural elements, even just like water fixtures that might be on the property, what are some good like colors that work with those separate things?
Right, some rules of thumb for this. For water, we typically like to go with either colors or whiter lights. And I don't know how often our audience is going to be designing through water. You know, a lot of the estates that the AV integrators are working on probably do have water features. Whiter is typically better, or different colors. Water is a fantastic way to incorporate colors. It really is. As far as the architecture, there's no right or wrong. What we like to focus on is something called CRI with architecture. The CRI, the higher the CRI, the higher the quality of the lamp, and the more architectural elements it will bring out. So we do like to focus on high CRI product, particularly when using that on architecture. Whether you use a 2700K or 3000K or 4000K on the architecture, we want to make sure that we're bringing out those elements. So the high CRI is actually even more important than the Kelvin temperature that's used. The CRI isn't quite as important in landscape elements, though. We don't have to worry about it quite as much. I'm not saying that CRI isn't important. Across the board, it is, because high quality lamps will typically have higher CRI. But in landscape, there are so many different ways to go about it. We mentioned, you know, I just mentioned two examples, sort of like your Japanese maple, which has that red foliage, which I can use either red light in or an amber light, something to bring out the colors. That's the key. It's working with the colors, not against the colors. I think that's the best way to look at it, is how do I work with the colors and not against it? Because me putting a white light on like a brown underleaf of a magnolia just looks like the tree is bleeding. However, if I hit it with an amber, for whatever reason, now we're not fighting against the underbrush. Now we're not fighting against the underbelly. We're fighting with it. And it brings out the natural beauty of the tree rather than fighting against it. So I think work with the colors of the foliage as opposed to against them is just a good rule of thumb.
So a little bit of brushing up on color theory is probably advantageous there.
Experimentation is the most advantageous. And experiment and many different types of properties with as many different types of architecture and foliage as you possibly can. Sure, there are rules of thumb, but nothing beats experimentation.
So does and you had mentioned this with like the moonlighting, where, you know, you kind of always want to, if you're planning on doing that like cooler color temperature with like the moonlight thing, you want to aim down, because obviously, you know, you're kind of mimicking how moonlight plays out in the natural world. Does like position or beam spread or any other like kind of hard quality of the fixture factor into these types of like what colors you want to be using as well?
Position and beam spread factor into color. I don't know. What I know is that position factors into everything. Whether it factors specifically into color, I'd have to think about it, and an answer may come to me as I'm talking more about positioning. But I will say this as far as positioning goes. Light that comes down is natural. Uplighting is not, there's no light, there's no natural light that comes up from the ground in the real world. The only light that comes up from the ground is reflected sunlight. Then it kind of bounces back off. But other than that, uplighting isn't natural. Downlighting is natural. And if I want to create a more natural feel, I'm absolutely using downlighting every opportunity that I get, because light that comes down just feels more comfortable to us because we're used to it with the sun and the moon. So as far as positioning goes, I bring it up because so few people do it, because it is extra work. Going up is a lot more work than putting a fixture in the ground and just shooting it upwards. But the benefits that you get from it, the differentiation in your design, I don't think you can put a price on that. So I do like to recommend that people use, I won't say downlighting all the time, but whenever there's an opportunity to downlight, take advantage of it, because that's something that we certainly don't do enough of. And when you are doing it, we don't want to create harsh spots on the ground. We want that to be nice and subtle, because there's nothing harsh about moonlighting. It's soft, it's subtle, it's elegant. So you mentioned beam spread. That's where we want to use something wide, something soft. We're not trying to create like harsh spots on the ground. We want to mimic nature. So typically a wider, softer light, whether I'm uplighting, whether I'm downlighting, that's a great way to mimic nature.
So we're almost at the tail end of this. Say you're addressing somebody who has been listening us to talk about this for the entire time. Do you have any specific products on the market that you recommend for somebody who is just getting started out with color tunable systems?
No, are any of my manufacturers listening? Do I have to
Probably.
Because boy, specific ones to get started in it. That's it. That's another good question. They're all good questions, but I don't like to overcomplicate things when I'm getting started. So what's the simplest way for me to start? I will mention a product that's really simple. It's simple, but it's robust, it's saturated. There's a Lumion product out there that you just use an IR remote. Right now, it's not app controllable. It's literally just like you're using a television remote to either change color or change the brightness of it. So they call them the Lumion Pro modules. And there is no one color product that is perfect for every scenario. There's not. Like if someone says, oh, this is all I use for color changing, then they're missing the mark, because FX product, the FX Luxor system is going to be useful in some areas. The WAC Color Splash, your Alliance color changing system, Unique, Halco, Brilliance has some. Like the majority of the big manufacturers nowadays have some type of color changing system. But if you're just getting started with it, let's start with something that's simple, that allows us to make easy changes, to understand what works best. And I feel like a simple remote with the ability to not only change color, but also change brightness, which is more important than the color changing aspect of it anyhow, is dialing in the brightness and getting that right. I think that Lumion Pro module system is a really nice place to start for people.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, I want to thank you once again for taking the time to sit down and chat with us, and I look forward to the next time.
Nicholas, as always, I enjoy these meetings. Thank you for the time. I appreciate you.
And for everybody that's still listening, be sure to check out the webinar linked in the description in case you want to learn more about this. It's about an hour or so, so it may be a bit of a tall order, but maybe flip it on during a car ride like I usually do. And until next time, take care.